Anthony Noto and SoFi have gone on the offensive in a huge way. A couple of days ago, filing a legal complaint against the Department of Education. Now, this is a huge statement, and it potentially has game-changing repercussions for both SoFi and the student loan moratorium. And in this video, we're going to cover all of the specifics. Okay, so this video, I'll break it down in a couple of segments, talking about the context, the arguments, the ask, and my thoughts to top it all off. So let's start first with the context behind this move. This was a legal complaint that was filed on March 3rd, and then a few days later on March 6th, it was released against the Department of Education and Miguel Cardona, who is the U.S. Secretary of Education. The reason for this was due to the moratorium pause, where student loans have been pushed back 8 different times by the administration since March of 2020. This is an ongoing situation that we know has affected SoFi because SoFi's biggest business segment was student loans. At the time, I think it comprised around 60% of their total revenue. So naturally, this move was going to hurt the company. And the fact that it's been extended so long just accentuates that issue even more. It inflates it as a topic of concern and inevitably led to this legal complaint. Now, the document itself seeks relief related to the extension of the moratorium in connection with the pandemic. So that's the context. Let's now hear what are the specific arguments in this document. Now, this is a 32-page document for induction relief, which I'll attach in full in the description. This is a public filing. And here in this video, I just want to summarize the main points that SoFi brought up. They highlighted that on August 24th, the Department of Education announced a $519 billion program to cancel student debt for certain federal borrowers, and this was later declared unlawful by multiple courts. This is essentially what brought the decision to a Supreme Court judgment out of the administration's hands. The Department of Education announced an 8th extension to the loan moratorium on November 22nd, 2022, citing uncertainty caused by the debt cancellation litigation. Now, this is the backstory that led up to this event, and the first points that SoFi highlighted in their arguments was the discrepancy between the CARES Act and the HEROES Act. So basically, the CARES Act temporarily suspended interest and payments on federally held student loans at the start of the pandemic. So back in March of 2020, the CARES Act was invoked, which said we don't have to pay interest because everybody is hurting financially from the repercussions of what's going on in the world. However, the Department of Education declared a moratorium, basically pausing student loan repayment for all federal borrowers and extended it multiple times under the HEROES Act. Now, this clearly presents a couple of problems, which SoFi highlighted in their core arguments. Basically, the first argument is that the extension is unlawful because it applies to all federal borrowers, not just the ones that are affected by the pandemic, and does not attempt to address harm from the pandemic. The complaint reads, unlike the other extensions, the Department of Education did not claim that continuing the moratorium was necessary to address harm caused by other borrowers affected by the pandemic. Instead, the department asserted that the further extension was intended to alleviate uncertainty for borrowers during the pendency of ongoing litigation regarding to the debt cancellation program. So to really simplify it, they're basically saying that we started this act as a result of the pandemic, but the fact that we're extending it so far doesn't make it about the pandemic at all, simply for the fact that it applies to all borrowers, not just the ones that were affected by the pandemic. So there is a discrepancy there between this being a relief that was related to the pandemic versus a relief that is broad sweeping. The second argument presented in this document goes in depth on the HEROES Act, arguing that the HEROES Act requires clear congressional authorization. This is basically the same argument that brought this issue to the Supreme Court. Judges around the country argued whether the administration had such broad sweeping powers to just go ahead and announce debt forgiveness and moratorium extensions without any congressional approval. The HEROES Act says that they need congressional approval. SoFi argues in this document that they did not seek that congressional approval, therefore making this unlawful. Basically just saying that the administration needed permission by Congress and they didn't get it, which invalidates this whole thing. Now, the third main argument made by SoFi in this document is that the Department of Education failed to provide adequate public notice or explain why the extension satisfies statutory requirements. So just to summarize and super simplify, the three main arguments are: number one, that it applies to everyone and this is not about the pandemic anymore. Number two, that the administration didn't even have the authority to make this move. And number three, that they didn't give any public notice before making this move. I think these are strong arguments. I'm not going to comment on whether I think SoFi is going to win or not, but obviously the fact that they formally filed this complaint just shows their inherent confidence in the fact that they can actually win this case. Now, what they're asking for, this document I think was fairly straightforward in explaining. SoFi is asking for the court to end the payment pause, so the moratorium, at a minimum for borrowers who would not be eligible for Biden's student loan forgiveness program. And as a reminder, the forgiveness program was to forgive up to $20,000 in debt for individual borrowers who earn less than $125,000 a year. Now, if we look at SoFi's average members for student loans, they would not fall into this bucket because SoFi's average loan members earn over $160,000 per year. So SoFi is basically saying, look, these people that are our main user base are not going to fall into the same bucket. They're never going to get a single dollar forgiven by the Biden administration. Let's continue the repayment for those individuals at the very, very least. And of course, as SoFi investors, this is what we want. We don't really care about the loan forgiveness passing through. We just want the moratorium to end, simply for the fact that SoFi members can't even take advantage of the loan forgiveness portion. Another point that they highlighted was that during the pause, the government set interest rates to zero for federal student loan borrowers. With these benefits, borrowers have little incentives to actually refinance their loans with SoFi. And in the document, SoFi highlighted that they already lost more than $6 million due to the 8th extension of the pause, and they project that they will lose $25 to $30 million if the payment pause remains in place through August. Now, of course, this is a financial repercussion for SoFi's business that was affected by this decision. So in other words, if SoFi were to win this case, two things would likely happen. Number one is simply that the moratorium would stop and SoFi would see a resurgence in their student loan business because people would be forced essentially to pay their student loans again. And number two, there could be some financial benefits for SoFi as repercussions for this decision that was made that hurt them as a business financially. Now, to wrap up this video, I'll just share some of my thoughts in the pros and the cons to try to provide a nuanced take. The pro is if this lawsuit works out in SoFi's favor, then we can see a massive acceleration in the student loans business in excess of when that moratorium was initially supposed to end. It would be a big win for SoFi investors and the sentiment around that, as the financial benefits would accelerate the business, considering the fact that student loans was a huge portion of SoFi's total revenue. It also puts more pressure on this topic from a political perspective, which emphasizes that Supreme Court decision even more. But obviously this is a very risky move because on the cons section, naturally with SoFi being a smaller business, this move is very, very loud. It makes a lot of noise. It generates bad press for SoFi as it can be seen as a very desperate move from the company, especially because payments were set to resume 60 days after the Supreme Court issued its ruling, or in late August, whichever came first. The justices just last week heard oral arguments in the cases over the student loan forgiveness program and are expected to release a decision in late June or early July. And SoFi themselves even said in their 2023 guidance that they expect to have student loans back up and running in the fall of this year. So basically making the argument to say, why rock the boat and make so much noise around this when we've been through it for 3 years? It's going to be over in a couple of months when the Supreme Court makes their decision. It's out of the administration's hands. It's now in the Supreme Court's hands. Why would we go through such high risk lengths to make this move? And just to highlight what I mean by SoFi making waves and SoFi having bad press, the Department of Education is obviously immediately going to take a moral high ground here. In a statement that they released 2 days ago on Tuesday to CNN, they said, quote, "This lawsuit is an attempt by a multi-billion-dollar company to make money while they force 45 million borrowers back into repayment, putting many at risk of serious financial harm." So obviously that's a very, very charged statement made by the Department of Education, which paints SoFi in an incredibly negative light. SoFi also responded to CNN on Tuesday with a quote of their own saying, "We have supported and continue to support targeted student loan forgiveness. In addition to the student loan payment moratorium during the economic crisis at the height of the pandemic." So targeted is the optimal word there, basically saying people who are actually making under $125,000 or fall out of SoFi's bracket. However, it is time for the administration to follow through on its word to end the federal student loan payment moratorium. Now, we've mentioned on the SoFi Weekly podcast and also on this channel that we would be covering this event because it's huge for SoFi and it basically makes or breaks a lot of their numbers. If student loans comes back much quicker than we expect, then obviously that's a huge positive towards them reaching that profitability. If student loans is pushed back into 2024, then obviously that's a huge headwind for the business, right? So this is really important given how big student loans is in SoFi's portfolio of revenue generating products. Now, obviously, this news is very fresh. It's only a couple of days old right now, and there's going to be more developments to come as to how that progresses. But this is really interesting, and it's a very risky move for SoFi. We'll see if it pays off for them. I personally bought more shares yesterday, regardless of this decision, just because I think the business from a fundamental perspective is absolutely rock solid, and I'm very bullish on it. We're probably going to be talking about this on the SoFi Weekly podcast this week, so make sure you tune in on Friday at 10 p.m. For right now, this is the Fundamentals Investing Podcast. Thank you so much for listening.